Let's continue our discussion of navigation. And what we're going to be focusing on today in particular is long distance navigation, such as what is involved when species migrate long distances. And one of the lessons that's going to emerge from this discussion is that animals need to use multiple sources of information in order to be able to carry out these incredible feats of navigation, including exploiting magnetic cues, so the magnetic fields of the earth, celestial cues like the positions of the sun and stars, and as well as relying on their sense of smell to figure out where they're going. All right, so let's start by discussing some of the incredible feats of navigation that animals are able to carry out. As we know, some animals migrate vast distances, and to do so, obviously, they have to navigate to figure out where they are and how to get to where they want to go. So, for example, many species of birds migrate thousands of miles each year, and they're able to somehow find a very, very specific location. And one of the most incredible examples of this is the Arctic tern, which you might see around here at certain times of the year. If you go to Bolsa Chica, for example, you can see them at the right time of the year. Arctic terns, hence the name, they breed in the Arctic Circle in the summer, and then they migrate all the way to Antarctica, so the opposite end of the world, in wintertime. And this is a round trip of 35,000 kilometers each year. And as I said, they manage to return to very specific location, right? Their breeding grounds, year after year. And you can see the routes that they take in this picture of the globe that I've included. So how are they able to navigate across such vast distances, right? 35,000 kilometers each year? Well, these birds and many other animals as well, they possess many systems of navigation. So they typically don't rely on a single source of information, right? They need to integrate multiple sources of information. Why? Because each system possesses its own limitations, right? It doesn't work under certain conditions. So it's important to be able to rely on other sources of information. So what are some examples, right? Long distance navigation includes using celestial cues, including the position of the sun if it's during the day, right? We know that the sun goes from east to west through the southern sky in our hemisphere. So if you know the time of day, you can figure out where north is. Right, they can also use the stars if they migrate by night. Some animals seem to have a magnetic sense, right? They can detect the magnetic fields of the earth and allow them to navigate in this way. They may use landmarks or, as I said, the sense of smell. And this idea of using multiple sources of information can be illustrated by loggerhead turtles, shown below. Right? They integrate multiple sources of information, and the information is used at different points in time, as we'll see. All right, so these turtles, they hatch in nests on the beaches of Florida, and then they scramble onto the sea, and then they swim 30 or 50 miles till they find the Gulf Stream, and then they spend years sailing around in loops on the Sargasso Sea. And then after doing this for years, they return to the beaches of Florida, they lay their eggs, and then the cycle continues with the next generation. So the question is, how are they able to do this? How are they able to carry out this incredible feat of navigation? Well, the figure shows the path that these turtles take over the course of years. And as we'll see, each step along the way is guided by very specific sources of information, right? They rely on different cues from beginning to end. Right, so each cue points them in the right direction. So for example, after they hatch, right? So right after they hatch, they leave their nest and they move towards the brightest spot. And what's the brightest spot? The beaches. They hatch at night, so the beaches are dark. So the brightest spot is the water, right? The ocean. Why? Because it reflects the stars and the moon. Right? So it's the brightest thing. So they move towards the brightest spot. And then once they're in the water, they swim towards the waves, right? So they don't get lost in the shallow water close to where they hatch, right? Instead, they swim towards the waves. They can detect where the waves are and they move towards them. And then once they're in the water, they also detect magnetic waves. And we know that they use magnetism to guide them towards magnetic east, because studies have put devices, gear, that can disrupt magnetic waves. And when those devices are turned on, they lose their sense of direction, right? They no longer swim east. And once they find the Sargasso Sea, they navigate by following the Gulf Stream, right? And that's a stream of water that moves in a regular and predictable direction. So as I said, one of the cues that the loggerhead turtles seem to use is a magnetic sense, right? They navigate towards the east, and they seem to be using a magnetic compass to do so. And lots of animals have been suspected of using a magnetic sense, including bees, birds, ants, turtles, salmon, sharks, whales, and so on. But I want to focus for the moment on birds' use of magnetism. And there's evidence going back decades now that shows that birds can do this. And one of the first people to study this was Merkel and Frum in 1958. And they demonstrated magnetic sense in certain birds using what's called an Emlyn funnel. Right, so it involves having these migratory birds stand on ink pads inside the funnel, and the wall of the funnel, which they can kind of hop onto but not stand on for too long, that wall is made of paper. So as you can imagine, right, the ink on their feet causes marks to be made on this paper, and you can see where they prefer to hop to. And they look at this while the birds are experiencing what they call migratory restlessness. Right, so they do these studies during the times of the year where these birds normally migrate. So this is what the Emlyn funnel looks like. You can see the ink pad on the bottom, the bird standing on it, and then the walls of the funnel made of paper. So they can't stand on it, but they can hop onto it and then fall back. And what we can see is that during the fall, right, the birds tend to hop mostly in a southern direction, while in spring they hop mainly in a northern direction, right, the directions to which they migrate at different times in the year. And the circles on the right-hand side indicate what the typical ink patterns look like on the Emlyn funnels depending on the time of the year. But they could be using other cues, right? So we don't know, for example, that it's magnetism that's involved just based on this hopping pattern. So the studies by Merkel and Frum were done in a chamber where you could turn on a certain system and it would disrupt the magnetic fields around the funnel. And when they did that, when they turned it on and disrupted the magnetic fields, you could see that their hopping behavior became random. And that's the pattern observed in the bottom of the figure, right? There are no patterns in terms of which direction they prefer. It's just all over the place. when they can't rely on magnetic information. All right, so the question now becomes, well, how can an animal use the magnetic field of the Earth to navigate, right? How is that possible? Well, where does this field come from, right? We know that the field is generated by movements of the molten iron core at the center of the Earth, right? This hot iron core swirls around and it creates this magnetic field that actually protects the Earth from dangerous solar radiation, right? So the movement generates an electrical current that creates magnetic waves which leave the Earth and then re-enter the Earth, right? So the magnetic waves leave from the south and re-enter the Earth's crust from the north, right? So it looks something like this. You can see the arrows indicating the directions of the flow of the magnetic waves, right? They go from south to north. Now we also know that magnetic fields magnetic waves possess two separate dimensions, right? There's two ways of describing them. The first is in terms of their polarity, and this has to do with the direction that the waves travel. And as I just said, they naturally travel from south to north. And the second dimension that you can use to describe magnetic waves is their inclination, which is the angle at which the waves exit and re-enter the Earth. Right? So the angle that's made by the intersection of the wave and the Earth. And the inclination depends on latitude. Right? So at the magnetic poles, right? At the magnetic poles of the Earth, the magnetic north and magnetic south, the inclination is 90 degrees. So the waves enter the crust perpendicular to it, right? So at a 90-degree angle. But at the equator, the inclination approaches zero because the waves tend to run parallel to the surface of the Earth. Right? So a bird that can detect the inclination, right, the angle at which the waves are entering and exiting the Earth, can figure out whether it's moving in a northern or whether it's moving closer to a pole or farther away from it. Okay? As if the inclination is getting greater, if the angle is getting steeper, then the bird knows it's getting closer to a pole. And on the left here, you can see what I'm talking about, the wavy line through the center of the Earth. That's the magnetic equator. You can see that the inclination there is 0 degrees because the magnetic waves run parallel to the Earth. And then you can see the angles getting steeper as you get to magnetic north and magnetic south. So I'll briefly tell you about a study by Wilczko and Wilczko. They looked at European robins and they tested them in Emlyn funnels. And they showed that the magnetic compass of birds is sensitive to inclination, but not to the polarity of the magnetic waves. Right, so their apparatus, very complicated to describe, but for our purposes, what we can say is that they were able to, with this device, they were able to change the polarity of the waves, right, going from north to south instead of south to north. Right, they could change the polarity, they could manipulate the polarity while leaving the inclination the same, or they could manipulate the inclination of the waves, leaving the polarity the same. And that's how they found that the birds could not detect changes to polarity, but they could detect changes to the inclination of the waves. Right, so changing inclination affected their hopping pattern in the Emlyn funnel, but changing polarity did not change their hopping pattern in the Emlyn funnel. But why is it that the bird's compass, right, their magnetic compass, is not sensitive to polarity? Right? It seems like it would be useful for birds to be able to detect polarity. This is especially the case around the equator, where there's no reliable way of telling north from south, right? Because, as we said, the magnetic waves run parallel to the surface of the Earth, right? So if they could detect polarity, they could see, oh, it's going from south to north, so they know which way north is. However, what we need to keep in mind is that the polarity of magnetic waves is not a stable feature of the Earth, right? In the last 5 million years, there's been at least 24 reversals of polarity, reversals of north and south. And the last one, as a matter of fact, occurred about 700,000 years ago. Right, so what does this mean? Right, over the course of the evolution of bird species, right, the Earth's poles, magnetic poles, have reversed several times, right? So for something to function as a selection constraint guiding evolution, it has to be a stable feature of the evolutionary environment, right? But polarity isn't such a feature, right? Polarity has reversed multiple times, and if birds had evolved a polarity compass, right, this could have been disastrous for them, right? Because let's say that they had evolved a certain system. If all of a sudden polarity reversed, then they might fly in the wrong direction in winter, say, and end up in the wrong place. So inclination is something that is stable over time, but polarity isn't. So that's why they've evolved a inclination compass and not a polarity compass. And the last thing I want to talk about with respect to the magnetic sense in birds is that Wiltschko and Wiltschko more recently have provided evidence that birds may actually be able to see, certain birds may actually be able to see magnetic waves, right? And that's how they sense them. And for example, European robins, right, a common bird that's been studied in this regard, they have photoreceptors in their eyes that are sensitive to blue light. And blue light is the kind of light that's most evident late in the day, right before dark. The sky looks very blue. And those photoreceptors that are sensitive to that blue light also have a photopigment, right? Those photoreceptors have a photopigment, a pigment that reacts to light, right? And they have this photopigment that's differentially affected by the inclination of magnetic fields, right? So different degrees of inclination cause greater or lesser activation or reaction in this photopigment. Right? And it's not affected by the polarity of the magnetic waves. So what this means is that these birds, just before dark, they may be able to see magnetic waves and then be able to decide, based on seeing this magnetic inclination, they may decide on which direction to fly, and then rely on other cues other than magnetism once it's already dark. They may rely, for example, on stars, things like that, which we'll discuss next. Right, so as far as celestial cues, I've mentioned, for example, the sun compass. We've seen that bees can use the sun compass, but birds can also use a sun compass to navigate. I'm not going to talk much more about that, but I want to talk about celestial cues that birds might use at night, right? They might use stars in the night sky in order to navigate. So we know that birds migrate during the night, and the question is, well, how do they do it? They may use stars, right? So they may spend some time looking at the night sky, and seeing the movement of the stars, right? If you spend some time looking at the night sky with patience, obviously, you can see that there's a certain pattern, there's a certain movement to the constellations. And one of the things that you would notice is that the constellations appear to rotate around certain fixed stars, right? Stars that don't move. And in the northern sky, right, if you look towards the north, one such star is Polaris, right? Different constellations appear to rotate around Polaris. Right, so this is what it looks like. We have Polaris in the center, and we have these different constellations that appear to rotate around it. So a bird that can look at the sky and can see these patterns can tell which way north is based on the location of these stars. All right, finally, I want to talk about the use of olfactory cues in migration. Right, olfactory obviously has to do with sense of smell. And the way that smell works is by detecting the presence of chemicals. For us, that would be chemicals in the air. Right? But for other species, it might be detecting chemicals that are present in the water. So some studies have shown, for example, that pigeons, who are notorious homing animals, right? You can release them and they're able to find their way back to their roost. It seems as though they exploit the presence of certain olfactory cues, right? Certain scents that are located around their home range. But fish also seem to have a sense of smell, and at least some of them seem to use it for navigation. And one example of this is sockeye salmon. Right, so what we know about salmon, you probably know this too, is that they're born in freshwater streams in such places as, for example, British Columbia. And then they navigate down these streams, they enter the ocean, spend years in the ocean, and then they return to their streams to spawn and then die. Right, so they return to the same streams where they spawn and then die. So here's an example of some migratory routes for different kinds of salmon. And the question is, well, how are they able to find their streams, right? How are they able to go back to their streams? And one cue that they seem to use is a sense of smell. Right, so they find their home stream using a sense of smell. So one of the early studies on this was done by Greer and Burke. They used salmon that were raised in a lab, and they were raised in certain streams where there were different chemicals that were placed in the water. Right, so they were raised in water that had a certain chemical, and then they were put into a 4-arm radial maze, a large radial maze with 4 arms and a central tank. And they put in these 4 arms, they put different scents, and they wanted to see which arm of the maze would the salmon swim toward. Right, so they put them in the central tank, they released different smells or chemicals into the water, which translates into smells, and they saw which direction the salmon tend to go. And they found that the salmon tend to swim into the arm that contained the odor, right, the chemical that they were raised with in their water. Right, so showing that they use olfactory cues, at least as part of their navigation. Alright, so in this lecture we've discussed the use of multiple cues during navigation. We talked about the magnetic compass, especially in birds. We also discussed briefly how birds use celestial cues like stars, and also olfactory cues by salmon to find their home stream for spawning.